So what he will do is he doesn't have our booking committee is set up very differently. It's a load of guys don't sit in a room. A few of us sit down. We plan out how we want to go, and then the intricacies of the continuing storyline will go to someone like Greg Lambert because he's excellent at that. You just got to see the FWA product, and then the actual direction of the guys, how they should modify their acts, how they should because it is a shop window to get them work in other countries as well. Mm-hmm. That will be where Gabe comes in, and Gabe will basically say, look, I think this guy's good, I think we should change this, and so that's how it all comes together.
We mentioned earlier Tony Simpson, who, as you said, was, I guess, between you and him was where the idea for the new FWA came from. So Tony, as I think has been said on the website, is someone who's new to wrestling, at least in terms of promotion. Do you think that lack of experience is an asset or a disadvantage, and what do you think he brings to the table?
Well, I mean, I definitely wouldn't say that Tony's new to wrestling, because I know you said as a promoter, but promoting's all about the experience and being in those high pressure situations and stuff. That is what, a good promoter is not just about how many. I mean, I guess if you just want to do there's some companies around. Well, actually, no, I won't even say that because that could sound negative. But there's different types of. Some people run very basic wrestling shows, and they can be, you put your posters out, you put your flyers out, it's a nice family show, it's simple. Then you do things like super shows and or just even those high adrenaline shows. It's a totally different environment. It's the difference between being a stockbroker or a stockbroker or a surgeon, or working in a corner shop in a small town. One of them is that adrenaline rush. You're sweating, you're running around, sorting stuff out, and things are going on, and it's because that's and you can tell that in the quality of the show. When you're getting that show and people are psyched up, and that's how I prefer to run them anyway. If I'm just sat there stagnant watching the guys go through the curtain, I think it reflects on the overall feeling of the show. So Tony has been in high pressure situations through his career in banking and also property, but also what a lot of people don't know, he's travelled with me when I've done my super shows. Tony started at my wrestling school in 2001, and on a sort of personal level and stuff, like he used to come to my school up in Manchester. And yeah, he's travelled with me to super shows. He stayed with me, and when I've been doing these events, so he knows a lot about it. In fact, like if you watch the Danny Williams thing, when I had the pull apart with Danny Williams, Tony's one of the first people on the scene, because he wanted to be. He was a pro wrestler. He was doing shows. I guess he wasn't. He was a wrestler. He wasn't a pro wrestler. And I always thought he was really, really, really talented. But what happened was he just decided that it wasn't a business. Tony sees things from a business perspective, and I guess his lack of experience, as people would perceive it in the wrestling world, is a massive bonus, because what he lacks in experience in putting the wrestling side down, I more than make up for. But what he does is reins in any ideas that I have that might. I told him our relationship is, I think outside the box in all the, you can make a list as long as your arm of all the sort of out the box. Now, I'm sure people will say, quote this and go, what an arrogant, but it's true. Like the expensive tickets, the super show concepts, the fly-ins, the imports, even the syllabus that I've just sort of come together with Doug Williams and stuff with the BWC. These are all out the box concepts. Even writing a wrestling training book, so I said to Tony, my job is to pull stuff from outside the box into the box. Your job is to secure the stuff within the box once it's in there, because if someone's not in there securing it, then the box is just going to overflow and fall apart, which was sometimes a problem. So he brings stability to the entire equation, and his job is to make it a business, and he's not going to let his emotions overrule his business acumen, because he's a mark, as people say. I hate that expression, mark, because we're all marks, but Tony's not going to be such a mark for something that he's going to spend money needlessly and put the company under. And so I think his lack of experience in wrestling, because he spent that in banking and property and stuff like that, I think is actually it's more of a benefit than somebody who's been in it 20 years and is so blinded to what is cool wrestling-wise that they'll make silly financial decisions.
All right, we can't obviously spend this long talking about everyone who's on the team, but let's just go. Let's read you a couple more names. Well, 3 or 4. Len Davies is involved. Mark Sloan, Doug Williams, Ricky Knight. Very briefly, what are all their roles within the company? Well,
Len, it was really unfortunate what happened with Len, because when I got involved with Len brought so many assets to the table that had not been brought in, the production values and all this kind of stuff, and the way the shows looked were recorded. He wanted to pump money into it, and I think it was unfortunate because wrestling goes in cycles, and he came along just as the UK wrestling dip was starting to come. FWA peaked it, and then it dipped again, and I think not that it's come back up, but everybody's just so desperate for it to work. So I remember saying to Len before, like, man, and I may not have said it to Len, but I said it to everybody else. If Len was around when we had FWA, it'd be a totally different story. You know, we were struggling to make the shows look good, and that's what he brings to the table. Len's got a real good eye for production and live events. His heart is in being on the road and doing that stuff, and he's a workhorse. So it was a no-brainer for us to work with Len, because that's the stuff that he brings to the table. If you go to our show, if you think our DVDs look good, if you think our sound and light and all that kind of stuff looks good, the fact that we're hiring office space from Len, it's those things that are going to make the product look more professional that he brings to the table, and a really strong work ethic. Doug Williams, you mentioned in there. Doug Williams, it doesn't need an introduction. Doug is the biggest ambassador for British wrestling that we've had in the last 20 years. I mean, I've known Doug since my first week at wrestling school. So, and Doug now, in a strange way, Doug is actually more famous now than he's ever been, even though people see him at not the tail end of his career, because he isn't by any stretch of the imagination, but it seems like he's been around, like, having 5-star matches in this country forever, and yet now he's the most successful he's ever been. So Doug is a huge asset. And somebody that, what Doug is, it's never ever been credited for to the extent that he should be, is Doug is the person that made British wrestling, British tech wrestling, cool again. When you see all the indie guys doing tech wrestling, that was Doug that did that. And I remember saying it to Doug once, and he said, "Man, I've often thought that, but I didn't think anyone noticed." And I'm like, "Well, I know it. It's like, Mark Sloan."
Sorry, what's Doug doing within the company?
Oh, Doug, he's doing several things, but the most important two are he's an agent backstage. Doug is going to be our agent. He'll wrestle when when it fits, but he wants to agent the guys. He wants to mentor the guys backstage, and because that's an area that Doug would excel in. Doug is going to one day he's going to be an awesome agent, and also he is our Japanese link for the grapple group. So when a guy goes, "Alex, I want to get to Japan," boom, Doug will devise a route for them, which he's already done for a couple of guys. Sort of told them where they need to be aiming for, because he's obviously got really good links in the Orient and stuff. So they're the two main roles that Doug brings. Mark Sloan, Mark is probably one of the most unsung heroes in British wrestling, because Mark is a specialist. I'm a show stealer, so I'm going to be the loudmouth person doing the radio interviews and getting controversy on the internet and stuff. Mark's the specialist, and that's what he's done. He specialised in... His skill brought the FWA. When I first went to an FWA show, I was a wrestler on that show, and I looked at it. It was only the second show, and I was like, "Wow, it's not like a British show that I've seen before." He wanted to make it look good. He's actually, he's doing staging and lighting and stuff. So some of the equipment's Len, some of it's Mark's, but he's very good at making. Even his academy he used to have looked spectacular. So what Mark brings to the table is making the FWA shows look really cool. That is his position.
So he's going to be like a production kind of role?
He's going to have a production role, and he's also quite heavily involved. It probably will be announced shortly after this, but he's going to be heavily involved in revamping the fan club. We've had some massive developments in the whole fan club, and he's massively involved in that.
Right, what about Ricky Knight?
Well, Ricky Knight, the Knight family is synonymous with British wrestling on a multimedia level. Like, they've done so many TV appearances, radio appearances, newspaper appearances and stuff. But Ricky, I was telling somebody this the other day, but the first good match I ever saw live, it was the first All-Star show I went to, and it was the Superflies with Soraya as their valet against James Mason and Steve Gray. And James Mason had only just started doing shows in Croydon. It was one of his earliest matches. And it was just, I remember the Superflies being heat machines, particularly Soraya, and the match was really, really good. So Ricky's, for me, the first live match you ever see is going to have, first good live match you ever see, when your desire is to bring good wrestling to England, is going to stick with you, right? So the first job I got outside of Hammerlock was with Ricky, and that's why when my price was going up to quite high for British standards, I'd always work the same rate for Ricky. So what Ricky brings is, we've got the charitable trust fund, which is linked to the Wrestlers Reunion, and Ricky's somebody that's really bridged the gap between the old school and the new school. So there's nobody else who seems more. There's a few guys. I'd say Drew McDonald, Ricky Knight, and Robbie Brookside are really the people who I think have really bridged that gap. But we've got a closer relationship with Ricky, so it made a lot of sense to involve him in the charitable trust fund. All right,
I'll hold off on talking about that for now, because I know we're going to come back to that. But there is, of course, one more person who we need to talk about who's heavily involved in this, the man who's created the most controversy, I think, certainly online, for his involvement, and that would be you.
Don Charles. No.